Frost stitched the wire white and the sky a hard enamel blue. Liesl Voss scrubbed a mess tin at the spigot, listening with the old half-ear she used to keep for the telephone in a Berlin command post. Then a shadow slanted over the yard. She looked up. A silver bomber idled across the zenith, contrail chalking a ruler straight line, absurdly high, almost indifferent. Her fingers moved by themselves, thumb and forefinger twisting an invisible key, dialing Seitenstellung as if a shell waited under her palm and the guns still spoke her name. The habit felt like prayer. Height to meters, wind correction, fuse delay. She ran the battery table out of memory and reached a sober answer. The burst would hang low, a black puff beneath that bright machine. The 8-8 she had served lived best in the comfortable sky of 20-odd thousand feet. The thing above her seemed to live beyond comfort. Across the fence, an MP laughed at a private's joke. The sound came thin, as if the air resented carrying anything but that white line. Hannah Reinecker, passing with a basket on the lane, shaded her eyes and listened to the silence where sirens used to be. Peace made a smaller noise. The guard followed their gaze. "Torship," he said, 20th Air Force. "She's done this loop all week." He didn't give a serial. Later someone would say 44-61679 and the number would stick. Oberleutnant Dieter Hartung, once a flak fire director, stepped into the sun and did what training makes the body do. Measure. True airspeed by eye, angle of light, a fine sawtooth bob at the edge of a thermal. He had learned to tease certainty from noise and now had nothing to spend it on. He imagined the 12.8-centimetre twins on Berlin and Hamburg towers winding up their hoists. On paper they could reach for the stratosphere. Celle had fields and roofs. The 8-8 that once guarded its yards spoke a lower dialect of sky. He thought of familiar visitors, B-17 and B-24s that tramped through the mid-20s where a predictor could still bully the future. The aircraft above wrote its own weather. A truck brought a red-haired American with a canvas tool roll and the relaxed authority of a man who knows how things truly work. T/4. Jack Red Malloy wore the propeller badge of a flight engineer and the grin of a mechanic forgiven for grease. He squinted up like a doctor reading a chart. In his head, manifold pressure at ferry power, cylinder head temps with cowl flaps, polite, fuel flow behaving if the R3350s were in the mood. Some days they weren't. He forgave them. He lifted 2 fingers in an easy greeting. Liesl, forgetting her role in the world's new order, returned it. "Which height?" she asked in German, palm flat like a horizon. He answered in feet, then meters. "About 33,000, he added, drawing a small circle with his finger to show the give and the take. She watched the circle and felt her old map crumple along its creases. "Above range," she said, not quite to him. They stood, heads tipped up. Jack said B-29A, as if naming a friend, and mentioned central fire control, remote turrets slaved to analog brains, so fewer gunners defended more sky. He did not boast, he explained, an American luxury she found hardest to resent. The bomber kept its course, oblivious to the tiny reckonings below. Someone muttered that flying such a machine only to show the flag seemed wasteful. The word landed strangely on Liesl's ear. Waste had once meant thin soup and missing fuses. Here it sounded like a nation so full it could afford manners. She turned the tin until the water ran clear. The afternoon smelled of wet rope. Children pointed. Later, steam from the laundry turned the barracks sweet and damp. Liesl tried to explain the feeling to Hannah. Höhe, Zeit, Korrektur, she said, the old nouns, their catechism, then shrugged at the edge of it. Hannah tapped the sill with her knuckles, blessing wood she could trust again. Outside, the contrail thinned toward a horizon suddenly far and near. Night would bring its own arithmetic, calories, rumours, a blanket folded double. But for the day, Liesl felt oddly relieved. She had spent years obeying tables that pretended to contain the sky. It felt clean to admit a limit. The machine above wrote 2 truths she could keep. The Act 8's comfort ended somewhere, and so did her war. By dusk the frost was gone, the wire glittered, somewhere still too high to matter, aluminum idled through blue no predictor could catch. The predictor ticked like a metronome made of teeth and oil, a small metal brain that ate angles and spat out orders. Liesel stood at the plotting board in a concrete room that smelled of damp wool and hot coffee, pencil poised over a grid laced with grease pencil arcs. The telephone chattered. Würzburg radar had a formation inbound, Angels 2-2, course northwest to southeast. In the Feuerleitung, Oberleutnant Hartung repeated the numbers, his voice level, and a runner clattered up to the gun floor with a message he could have whistled in his sleep. Outside, searchlights groped the cloud. The first bursts went up on schedule, black flowers planted at calculated heights, bursting not at the bombers, but a second in front of them, where the bomb site would put the future. The Act 8's recoil came through the concrete as a physical syllable. Liesel adjusted for wind, for air temperature that would slow the fuse, for drift that would push the pattern left. The board quivered as a nearby gun fired. Dust sifted from a crack a mason promised to fix when the war allowed promises. Someone at the balcony shouted "Treffer!" and for an instant the room exhaled. A firefly of flame far up meant a hit, or a damaged engine, or a wish fulfilled by chance. You learned not to claim. Hartung did not smile. "Maintain barrage," he said, and a young woman at the telephone repeated it because doctrine mistrusted joy. They worked the routine, range, deflection, fuse, repeat. The ammunition detail rolled shells along duckboards, fuse caps clicking under hands that once mended shoes and kept books. On good nights, a trained crew drove 20 rounds a minute, the rhythm as clean as a sewing room. On bad nights, the breech balked and someone's shoulder took the lesson. The gun captain counted off through a scarf. The loader swore when his glove stuck to cold steel. The pointer, a boy promoted by winter, stared at the sight until his eyes learned to separate stars from sparks. On the wall, a chart gave hope beyond merit. The 12.8-centimetre tower batteries, the flak-swilling monsters with twin barrels and hoists, could, on paper, loft steel to heights that mocked the clouds. There were not many. Everyone knew where they stood, like cathedrals from childhood. When rumour of a new American bomber reached the battery, someone pinned a magazine picture under that chart. The thing looked like a castle with wings. Liesel pretended not to care and traced the fuselage with her pencil anyway. Scarcity sneaked into everything. The heater coughed, then failed. Shell lots arrived with fuses a second slow, and you learned to add before subtraction made corpses. A Luftwaffenhelfer boy took on for a man with frostbitten hands the doctor wouldn't argue with. When coffee ran low, they boiled the grounds longer and called it doctrine. They made sentences out of shortages until the grammar felt natural. Hartung kept a notebook in his pocket. He wrote weather when the radar jittered and firing solutions when the predictor sulked. He wrote himself calm. One night he added a line that felt like blasphemy. "If they come higher, we will not meet them with what we have." He burned the page at shift change. The room smelled of tobacco and singed honesty. By midnight, the stream had passed, the last bombs tearing a string of bruises across a rail yard Liesel would not look at in daylight. Command lamps cooled to red. Hands found pockets. Someone produced a harmonica and played a tune the Americans would have known by a different name. Hartung rubbed the back of his neck and thought about engineers in a hangar somewhere drawing a thinner wing and a mightier engine. He did not know their names and disliked them on principle. Walking home through bitter air, Liesel carried the predictors ticking in her chest like a borrowed heartbeat. The city stank of burnt sugar and coal, the signature of a raid that had missed or hit or both, depending on where you stood. She stepped around a crater's rim and pressed her palm to a wall that had held. It felt like a person you dare not thank out loud. The rumour of a stratosphere war came back to her as a fairy tale drawn in blue chalk and dread. Yet in the barracks she caught herself twisting an imaginary key, setting a fuse for a height she had never seen. Habit is a second faith. She slept with the window cracked to let out the stink of fires, and let in a thin wind that carried nothing. The nothing was the gift. The nothing could not last. Jack Red Malloy hopped from the deuce and a half with a canvas tool roll and a grin roomy enough to share. "You're late, Red," the driver said. "The sky was on time," he answered, which was how he explained most things. The propeller insignia of a technician 4th grade glinted on his sleeve, the quiet authority of a man trusted with engines. He walked like someone who could diagnose vibration through boot leather. Prisoners drifted toward the wire as if the contrail tugged them along a string. Jack unbuckled the roll. Out came safety wire, a magneto wrench, 2 spark plugs in brown paper, a folded checklist greasy at the corners. He inventoried by touch and narrative. 1 for the job, 1 for the mistake, 1 for the weather. Where he came from, surplus wasn't boasting, it was policy. A guard squinted at the sky. "That one yours?" Jack shaded his eyes like a doctor reading a chart. "B-29A," he said. "Ferry power. If she's smart, she's sipping. Cowl flaps polite, not proud. R3350S are sweet when they want to be." He said it like grace before a meal. Liesl stood where he could see her without looking, posture of a worker who used to live by numbers. "Her?" she asked. "Height." He answered in feet, then meters. 33,000, give or take. Her fingers moved like a phantom key, dialing Zeiteinstellung out of muscle memory, height to meters, drift, delay. The answer she reached, without a board, without a phone, was that her old shells would burst low. That was not shame. That was physics. Jack saw the calculation cross her face and, out of respect, did not narrate the victory. He just stood with her under the same sky and let the numbers belong to both of them. He told the guard, and really everyone within earshot, that America had built them by the thousands and learned to keep them flying by the habit of having more. 3,970, he said, letting the number hang like a bell. "Program cost?" He shrugged. "About $3 billion, more than the atom folks." The statistic floated up to join the contrail and refused to come down. The impossible part wasn't the machine, it was the repetition. Wichita, Renton, Marietta. The names tasted like lunch counter pies. In 1944, the United States turned out nearly 96,000 aircraft. Germany managed barely 40,000. Jack wasn't an economist. He just knew a stocked shelf was a kind of air superiority. He'd slept in hangars with his head on a crate labelled Magneto's Spares and dreamed better because of it. He produced 2 chocolate bars in waxed paper. One he tossed to the MP, who caught it smooth. The other he broke into squares and held near the wire without making a show. A sergeant helped. Hannah, passing on an errand, caught a square like a coin and let it melt into a taste she would remember as peace. Abundance turned into generosity with the same soft click as a well-set fastener. Hartung drifted close, the posture of a man who had once worn a rank the air itself obeyed. Jack, seeing it, gave a nod that crossed languages. The older man asked questions that were really statements. Service ceiling versus where crews actually flew. What happened to time fuses when the air turned thin? How predictors lagged when searchlights lost the beam. Jack answered without condescension. "Altitude buys time," he said. "Time lets crews fix problems, pick fields, live." Hartung repeated the phrase in German, tasting each word like a mechanic tastes fuel for water. He had told crews for years that wind was the 5th gun. Here was a 6th he had never owned, schedule. He looked away so no one would see the relief that came from naming the thing that had always beaten him. Jack opened the magneto wrench to the light, turned it once, and put it away. We carry weather with us, he said. The MP asked what that meant. Spares, fuel, schedules, Jack said. If we know tomorrow is stocked, we can risk today. In Liesel's war, risk had been a fixed fee. In his, it was a budget line paid in advance by factories that never slept. The bomber's contrail thinned into silk. Conversation unravelled with it. The driver banged the door twice. Hydraulic lines sulking, he said. Jack shouldered the roll. Then we'll sweet-talk it, he answered, and the truck growled approval. Liesel watched him go and realised she had learned more about defeat in 10 minutes of American small talk than in 5 years of orders. Jack paused at the gatehouse and looked back, the way chiefs do when a ship is taxiing. Not for sentiment, but to verify the world remained in tolerance. The yard settled, yet Liesel felt everything had shifted by a few degrees, enough that tomorrow might line up with a new truth the way a prop governor finds its steady note. The white line was almost gone, but the thought it had written refused to fade, that a nation can choose to be predictable at scale and thereby make courage count double. It was a different kind of altitude, organisational kind, and it left you breathing easier even at ground level. The crate lid made a good blackboard. Jack drew a climb in 4 strokes, ground to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, then a long, thrifty cruise, because fuel had a vote. Liesel answered with curves learned in a concrete room, how a time fuse behaved as air thinned, how a burst cone narrowed, how confidence widened and then folded when wind sheared a calculation into folly. Their pencils met at 30,000 feet and parted. From there, the American line kept going while the German curve sagged like a hammock. Hartung hovered by the water barrel, pretending to inspect a dipper. He listened as if to a language half remembered from school. Jack spoke of service sealing as a promise engineers made to pilots. Liesel spoke of effective sealing as comfort officers sold to cities. Both truths fit until weather and fatigue turned honesty into survival. Jack sketched the superfortress's central fire control the way a proud uncle brags without quite bragging. Remote turrets slaved to sighting stations and an analogue brain that averaged error and forgave tremor. Fewer gunners, better coverage, less weight where weight was sin. Liesel recognised the mercy in that. Her battery had trusted calculators and courage. His system trusted redundancy. She didn't resent it. She envied the premise. She admitted, because war was over and dignity could survive the confession, that most nights the Acht murdered the sky and men slept anyway. Posters promised the high 20s and more, weather subtracted. Time fuses came from the depot a second slow and reminded everyone that seconds kill in 2 directions. Predictors lagged when the searchlights lost the beam. Hands shook. Oil thickened. After midnight, the math grew tired like people did. Saying it aloud felt like rinsing grit from a wound. They spoke of the big tower guns, the 12.8s that looked like altars. Hartung described twin hoists and concrete dust that lived behind your teeth. Yes, on paper they reached farther, but they were islands you could not tow to where trouble went. If a raid bent around a city's flank, the towers stood faithful and useless at the same time. He used the word cathedral and immediately apologised to no one in particular. The afternoon settled into the unremarkable quiet that follows a big thing that didn't hurt anyone. A few prisoners of war punted a lopsided ball. An MP taught a boy to flick a cigarette end without burning his fingers. Hannah passed with mending and grinned at Liesel as if sharing a joke whose punchline was simply not dying today. The contrail thinned to chalk. Jack shaded his penciled climb and wrote small figures along it, engine temps, fuel flow, a number for oxygen discipline that sounded like a prayer. Altitude buys time in the cockpit, he said. More seconds to diagnose, more options if an engine sulks, more fields if the day turns treacherous. He didn't add the corollary. He didn't need to. Time does the same for nations. If you build faster than you lose and train faster than you burn out, tomorrow arrives stocked. The enemy paid for today, his side prepaid the week. Hartung laughed, surprised by the sound. "We used to say the wind is the fifth gun," he offered. Jack answered, "We made the sixth, meaning schedule, meaning spares, meaning the quiet thunder of a continent leaning its shoulder against a calendar." Liesel imagined a map that measured time zones instead of fronts, and saw how a bomber could be the tip of an idea so heavy you didn't need to swing it often to make your point. The sun slid west and turned the wire to gold. Jack wiped the crate clean with the side of his hand, leaving a graphite ghost that would smear any sleeve that forgot it was there. He promised a letter to a crew chief he owed and a postcard home with a story his mother would like because it had no danger in it. Liesel stacked tins by size the way her mother had before sirens gave names to nights. Supper bell rang, a sound like competence rather than absence. "Altitude buys time," Jack said again, almost a benediction. Hartung translated it and said it back, because good doctrine belongs in both languages. The chalk line of the sky went soft as breath. For a moment they all stood still, measuring what the afternoon had shown them, that the space between numbers could be mercy if you had built the room for it. The plant floor throbbed like a living drum, steady enough to teach feet and hands their places before a foreman spoke. A chalk line snapped down a shining fuselage and dusted the air with gypsum that tasted faintly sweet. Women in headscarves and men in denim leaned into rivet guns that hammered in counterpoint, teams trading pressure and release without looking. Overhead, a travelling crane rolled shore. Its hook moved with trust both ways. A girl from Newton set Klikos with the economy of a piano player's left hand. She called herself a kid, except she drew union pay and bought war bonds with a seriousness that pleased the old men. At break she read a letter from a cousin in the Marianas who wrote about engines the way farmers write about weather. She didn't know manifolds, but she knew a parts list was a prayer the factory could answer. The work made heat that stuck inside your shirt, noise that stayed in your ears, and a vocabulary that fused into muscle, spar, stringer, skin, fastener. Inspectors with dial gauges signed off as if approving baptisms. A woman who had never seen an ocean became expert with de-icers. A farrier learned to love tolerances measured in hairs. The Republic minted specialists the way spring makes leaves, suddenly, everywhere, each leaf doing its job. Boxes stenciled from Marietta and Renton fed the line. Logistics kept a wall map threaded with string, suppliers pinned to deadlines. When a truck missed the morning gate, the strings looked like sutures under strain. They held. The miracle wasn't a miracle at all. Planning, payrolls, nights that ran longer than the sun. The cafeteria smelled of coffee and onions and the ordinary holiness of a second shift. They didn't say the price out loud. It felt like counting money in church. About $3 billion for the superfortress, more than the atom work out west, someone said, and left it. You didn't need secrets to understand scale. You looked at the parking lot at changeover and felt the weight. By summer, you could stand at the line's end and watch a bomber born in stages, ribs and spars finding a spine, skins settling, wiring looms tamed. The first airframe seemed surprised by daylight. The next taught the door to be inevitable. A supervisor posted a chart. In 1944, the United States would turn out nearly 96,000 aircraft. Germany not much above 39,000. Jack Malloy visited on liaison and walked the line like a pilgrim who knew not to touch the saints. He thanked a woman for a clean run of rivets as if she'd stitched his own skin. He told a crew, half joking and wholly sincere, that maintenance was theology and spares were sacraments. The shop laughed the way devout people laugh when somebody names their God out loud. At lunch, a kid lifted a newspaper with a tiny photo of a superfortress over Japan and said what the foreman never would. This was a sound the enemy could not outshout. Doors opened. A wind curled through the bay and lifted paper cups and old sawdust and a tired man's spirits. On its back rode a smell that never left, aluminum warmed by hands. They learned the rhythm of scale until it felt like virtue. Tooling crews swapped jigs in minutes, stores counted by crates, inspectors learned to find the one rivet that lied. Planners married parts to paydays and swore that what left Wichita on Wednesday could wear Pacific Sun by Sunday if rails behaved. By autumn, the supervisors started using a new number the way preachers use a text, 3,970, the tally the program would reach. You could feel the pride in the way a broom pushed. A girl from the paint shop learned serials by heart the way soldiers learn companies. Nobody said victory would be easy. They acted as if it were scheduled. The foreman taped a note by the clock. "Bring your eyes and your hands. Your country will furnish the rest." Heads nodded. The line moved. The door stayed inevitable. The hangar roof leaked in 2 places and drafts came at ankle height, so the engineers wore thick socks and pride. By the stove, cups remembered better coffee. Drawings wanted better engines. On the wall, photographs of B-17 and B-24s at the comfortable altitudes where an 8-8 felt most itself. Beside them, sketches reached higher. A thin-winged interceptor, a pressurized cabin, a supercharger hungry for thin air. They called the projects by stern uncle names. TAR 152H, BV 155. They were answers to a question the sky had not yet asked over Germany. The calculations were precise. The context was not. Fuel thinned, pilots bled, factories moved underground, and learned darkness slows machines. You could design for 35 or 40,000 feet and make good arguments about wing area and intercooler placement and still lose the race because the starter pistol never went off in time. Hartung visited once to see whether his beloved flak towers might count on company at that height. An engineer with graphite knuckles showed him a wing rib and traced air over it with careful hands. "Here the lift lives," the man said, and Hartung nodded, a parishioner from another church. The towers he knew were certainties bolted into concrete, twin 12.8-centimetre guns that could, on paper, touch the high country. Interceptors were promises, expensive when the cashier was fate. They argued doctrine. Guns or fighters for the high country, radar or predictors to cheat geometry, and every answer conceded the same thing. It depended on fuel and engines delivered on time. Across the ocean, tomorrow kept arriving in crates. At the tower sites, the 12.8 seconds, rare, roughly 1,000 in the Reich, stood like altars where a city brought the same offering as always, steel and sweat against someone else's abundance. They served, sometimes worked, often bought only belief. Even a cathedral cannot move to meet a raid that refuses your map. Liesel, rotating through a tower battery, learned what concrete tasted like when dust lived behind your teeth and never left, and how fatigue makes doctrine honest. The impossible statistic arrived first as rumour and later as a chart that did not blink. In 1944, the United States built nearly 96,000 aircraft. Germany, a little under 40,000. Say it like weather, say it like gravity. A single American program would total 3,970 superfortresses at a cost around $3 billion. You could draw interceptors until pencils gave up. Arithmetic would still fly higher. Engineers kept drawing because engineers keep faith with lines when the world breaks. They penciled larger intercoolers and smarter superchargers, longer wings where thin air is stingy. A few prototypes flew like birds who knew the hunter's address. Pilots strapped on ambition and brought back data and, once, a grin. Then fuel arrived thin, bearings came late, and the men who might have made a squadron had already traded their names for dates on a wall. Projects chased an American ghost and caught only breath. Hartung remembered the hangars cold when he later watched a B-29 idle through autumn air over Celle, and felt grief for elegant answers that never met their questions. Liesel would read, years later, that the bomber program cost more than the atom project and think, not in anger, what a nation can decide to be when it chooses numbers the size of principles. The stove went out at dusk and nobody had the right wood to make it forgive them. A draft slid under the door like a deadline. Morning mist clung to the barbed wire like unclaimed laundry. Jack Malloy knelt beside a supply crate, the wood damp and smelling of tar. He pried the lid with a screwdriver and unfolded a manifest in neat block print. Magnetos, spark plugs, hydraulic seals, each item tagged twice, one label for the warehouse clerk and another for the aircrew that would trust the part with its life. He counted aloud in a soft Oklahoma drawl, each number a promise that tomorrow's flight would launch on time. Liesl watched from the fence, a strand of hair escaping her kerchief. The sound of numbers spoken without fear made her chest ache. Her own war had been ruled by shortages, fuses that arrived a second slow, barrels worn smooth, power lines gone dark after a single bomb. Here the Americans built abundance into doctrine. Jack explained it with the casual certainty of a man describing the weather. "Authorized stockage list," he said, tapping the paper. 2 spares for everyone we'll ever need. If we fix it today, we fly tomorrow. Hartung, once the master of Berlin's flak predictors, felt the irony bite. In his service, each night's ammunition was a gamble. The ministry rationed shells as if they were pearls, and commanders argued over who deserved the next shipment. He remembered standing before a half-empty magazine and promising civilians a defence he could not guarantee. Jack spoke of mean time between overhauls, of depot-level maintenance cycles planned months ahead. Germany had fought each day as if tomorrow might never be supplied. America fought as if tomorrow had already been purchased. Jack fished a spark plug from its paper sleeve and turned it so the sun winked off the threads. "You can tell a nation's heart," he said, "by how many spares it keeps for things that might break." His grin made it sound like common sense, but to Hartung it landed like a revelation. Redundancy was not waste. It was strategy. In 1944, the United States had produced nearly 96,000 aircraft, more than twice Germany's total of roughly 39,000. Jack recited the numbers as if reading a grocery list. To the Germans, they sounded like artillery. A few prisoners drifted closer. Hannah balanced a bucket on her hip and listened without shame. She had queued for ration cards so thin they crinkled like onion skin, watched her children's shoes go threadbare before the winter turned serious. The thought of warehouses stocked with parts that might never be needed felt at once like sorcery and mercy. Jack repacked the crate with a care that belonged in a sacristy. "We carry weather with us," he said again, meaning that abundance travels like a climate, predictable, forgiving, decisive. Liesl repeated the phrase under her breath, the syllables strange in German but satisfying. She saw the truth of it. America's victory was not a burst of luck, but the steady climate of readiness. Hartung looked at the spark plug one more time before Jack closed the lid. He thought of the predictor room in Berlin, of charts that grew more desperate as the winter of 1945 closed in, of the night he penciled a confession he later burned. If they come higher, we cannot meet them. The admission had felt like failure then. Now, with a silver bomber idling somewhere above the clouds and an American mechanic cataloguing surplus, it felt like simple fact. Jack nailed the crate shut. The hammer blows sounded like a clock marking the end of one age and the start of another. He straightened, wiped his hands, and nodded to the prisoners. "Tomorrow's weather," he said, "is already packed." Coal smoke rolled through streets already blackened by weeks of raids. Liesl pulled her scarf tighter as she hurried toward the flak tower, boots crunching on cinders. The sirens had begun their low moan before dawn. The city knew the ritual by heart. In the tower's predictor room, Hartung waited with his clipboard, face drawn but voice crisp. Würzburg radar reported a bomber stream crossing the Elbe. Altitude 22,000, course southwest to northeast. The first 8.8 centimetre guns spoke as Liesl took her station. The concussion vibrated through the concrete like the thrum of a giant organ. Dust sifted from the ceiling, and the air smelled of cordite and damp wool. Shells clanged along the duckboards, loaders working with the rhythm of men who had done this every night of their young lives. The predictor ticked, gears translating radar echoes into fuse settings. Liesl read off the numbers. A boy barely 17 dialed them in. Black bursts blossomed above the city, greasy flowers lit by the moon. Far off, a bomber rolled, its navigation lights like stubborn stars. A cheer rose, quickly swallowed. Hartung gave no acknowledgement. "Maintain barrage," he said, and the order passed like current through a circuit. Hours blurred into arithmetic. Time fuses needed correction for crosswinds. The searchlights wavered as smoke thickened. A crate of shells arrived with fuses a second slow. Hartung scrawled an adjustment and prayed his math outpaced the enemy's luck. By 3 a.m. the guns had fired thousands of rounds. The air shook with their labour, yet the bomber stream droned on, indifferent and immense. For a moment, during a lull, Liesl imagined the American giant the rumours described, a bomber higher still, beyond even the reach of the 12.8-centimetre flax willing that crowned the tower. She pictured a silver shape above the black puffs, serene as a planet. The thought chilled her more than the February wind. When the all-clear finally sounded, the city lay in bruised silence. Fires smouldered along the rail yard, windows stared like empty sockets. Hartung rubbed the bridge of his nose, pencil trembling. He thought of the chart he kept folded in his pocket. American production for 1944, nearly 96,000 aircraft. Germany, fewer than 40,000. Numbers like that made even victory feel like an illusion. He tucked the paper away as if hiding a weapon. Outside, the sky paled to the colour of old tin. Liesl stepped over rubble and felt the ache of muscles tuned to a war they were losing. Somewhere above, perhaps even now, a superfortress prowled a height where no predictor could follow. She whispered the fuse-setting catechism one last time, a prayer that no longer belonged to her. Smoke from the cookhouse drifted over the compound, carrying the smell of barley and something sweet. Jack Malloy leaned against a fence post, a chocolate bar in his hand, and watched the prisoners line up for their noon ration. He broke the bar in half, then quarters, letting the pieces fall into his palm like coins. Liesl approached with Hannah, curiosity overcoming caution. Jack offered a square through the wire without ceremony. Hannah caught it and tasted it slowly, the waxed paper crackling in her fingers. "American chocolate," she said in careful English. The words felt like a truce. Nearby, Hartung accepted a cigarette from an MP. He lit it with a match struck against the post, exhaling as if releasing years of calculations. Jack spoke of the bomber overhead 2 days before, explaining how the United States had built nearly 4,000 B-29s at a cost of about $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project. He said it casually, as though reciting a grocery list. To Liesl, it sounded like a sermon of abundance. Jack described how in 1944, American factories produced 96,000 aircraft, while Germany managed barely 40,000. He spoke not with triumph, but with the matter-of-fact tone of a mechanic describing engine torque. The statistic seemed impossible. It settled over the yard like a second sky. Hartung listened in silence. He remembered nights when his battery rationed shells, when the predictor ticked like a nervous heart because the next crate might never come. He understood now that America had not merely outfought Germany, it had outproduced it by an order of magnitude. The contrast between the chocolate melting on Hannah's tongue and the bitter coffee of his memories told the story without words. Jack passed the last square of chocolate through the wire. "Altitude buys time," he said again, and then added, "Abundance buys mercy." Liesl repeated the phrase softly in German. For the first time since the war began, she believed it. A crowd gathered as the touring B-29 taxied across the airfield, its polished skin catching the low sun. Children pointed. Veterans stood with arms folded, measuring the giant against the memories of bombers they had fought or feared. Jack Malloy watched from the edge of the tarmac, cap tilted back, a mechanic's pride in his eyes. The B-29 had never bombed Germany. The 8th and 15th Air Forces had already broken the Reich with B-17 and B-24s by the time the superfortress reached maturity. Yet its presence here, after the guns were silent, carried a different power. German engineers had spent years chasing the rumour of a bomber that could fly beyond their reach. They built prototypes like the TAR-152H and BV-155 and raised 12.8-centimetre flak towers like concrete cathedrals, all to counter a threat that never came. For Hartung, watching the great aircraft idle, the revelation cut deep. The war he had fought was a duel with physics, fuse timing against altitude, predictor gears against bomber speed. Now he saw that the Americans had fought a larger war, a war of production schedules and strategic patience. The B-29 represented not just a machine, but a nation's ability to create surplus so vast it could win without firing a shot in Europe. Jack explained to a curious crowd how the aircraft's central fire control system allowed fewer gunners to defend more sky, how its Wright R3350 engines could carry it over 33,000 feet. He spoke of the 20th Air Force, of missions across the Pacific, where Japanese leaders like Prince Fumimaro Konoe later admitted the relentless B-29 raids forced their hand towards surrender. The bomber's very existence had bent the arc of two wars, one it fought and one it never had to. The engines wound down and the airfield fell quiet. For the first time, Hartung understood that his predictor tables had never been the real battlefield. The Americans had waged a war of time, turning tomorrow into a weapon. The B-29 on the runway was proof that the decisive battle can be the one never fought. Ink on paper can carry a nation's heartbeat. In Washington, clerks recorded figures that would later read like legend: $3 billion for the B-29 program, 3,970 aircraft built, 96,000 total U.S. aircraft produced in 1944 alone. Across the Atlantic, Germany managed barely 40,000. Each column told the story of a democracy that turned factories into arsenals and schedules into weapons. Jack Malloy carried those numbers without drama. He had slept beside crates of magnetos and spark plugs and believed in abundance because he had touched it. Hartung, hearing the figures, felt a quiet awe that bordered on relief. The enemy had not failed for lack of courage. They had lost because a free people had chosen to be inexhaustible. The ledger of freedom included blood as well as steel. B-29 crews flew missions that burned fuel by the thousands of gallons and risked their lives in thin air where frost could kill as quickly as flak. Maintenance crews toiled through nights of sweat and frozen fingers so that pilots could greet dawn at altitude. Every spare part Jack counted represented hours of labour, every sortie a contract between citizen and nation. For Liesel and Hannah, the statistics were almost beyond comprehension. They had queued for bread and counted every lump of coal. Now they heard of an America that could spend more on a single bomber program than Germany could spend on its entire air force and still feed its people. The numbers sounded impossible, but the contrails above Celle had already testified. In the end, the war's outcome was not an accident of heroism or luck. It was the deliberate work of a society that turned democratic energy into industrial power. The ledger did not merely record victory, it explained it. Frost returned to the wire, tracing each barb in silver. Liesel threaded a needle beside Hannah in the barracks, the air smelling of soap and wood smoke. Outside, the sky lay empty, no contrail to mark the day. Jack Malloy stood by the gatehouse, orders in his pocket for a flight home. Hartung joined him, both men silent for a time, listening to a Europe that was finally still. They spoke quietly of the future. Jack would return to a country already retooling for peace, its factories still warm from war. Hartung wondered aloud how long it would take Germany to rebuild not its walls, but its trust. Liesel finished her stitching and stepped outside, the cold biting her cheeks. She no longer measured the sky in meters or seconds. The predictor's ticking had faded from her bones. Jack looked up once more, as if expecting the superfortress to appear. "No giant today," he said. Liesel followed his gaze and found only winter blue. She thought of the bomber overhead days earlier, higher than her guns, and of the factories that had built thousands more. The lesson was not humiliation, but clarity. The war had been decided long before the final barrage, in places where abundance was a discipline and freedom its engine. Hannah opened her diary and wrote, "Heute flog kein Riese, aber wir leben. No giant flew today, but we live." The words carried both warning and promise that a free nation's strength lies not only in what it can destroy, but in what it can build, and that the sky, once a battlefield, could again be simply sky.